It was my father who first made me interested in books. Not just any books, mind you, but the rare ones. The first editions, signed by authors. The ones that had gathered dust on their shelves for decades, if not centuries. The ones whose brothers and sisters had been burned en masse, though they survived the execution. "This, my son," he said when I was 13, and finally old enough for him to permit me into the back room of the house, which had been forbidden up to that point. The library. "This is my collection. A collection that will one day be yours when I pass." He took a puff of the pipe that was hanging from his mouth, smoke curling up from the tobacco within the rosewood, and continued. "With great effort, I have accumulated these over the years, and should you agree, you too shall become a scourer of the earth in search of fine texts. And here, my son, is your first. Nothing too special, mind you. An artifact, an antique." And he pulled down a book from a middle shelf, one I could barely reach, and placed it into my hands. By the light of the flames roaring in the fireplace, I read the cover. "Guests at the Kingsbury Inn, 1821 to 1827. Cracking it open, I saw rows upon rows of names there, a record of the visitors and dates that they had stayed in the inn, some 150 years before. 2 presidents stayed there, my father said. I won't ruin the surprise because you can find their names in the book." So I took the book, and I looked through the names, careful to turn the pages so that they didn't crack. I found a few famous names in there, presidents, inventors, and the like, and though the book was nothing more than a trifle, I came to enjoy it as the first of my collection. I kept it on my dresser, open, and I would often wonder about those who had written in its pages so long ago. And it was around this time that, as my father's health began to decline, a maid started coming around the house. A maid that cleaned, making my bed for me each morning, and dressed in a style that I presumed was from my father's youth. Miss Lantham, she said her name was, and she was most thorough, until my father's death, when I reached 18 years of age. I packed my belongings and moved into his room then, and Miss Lantham disappeared. I assumed she had taken after my father, that perhaps she considered her employment terminated when he reached his death. For some time I remember mourning him, for though he was my father, he was also my greatest friend, and the house was too quiet without his presence. But within a year of his death, I decided to take up his old hobby, that of book collecting, and knew I was fortunate that he had told me his greatest secret before his death. "Thomas," he told me on my 17th birthday, seated in one of the leather armchairs of his library. "Thomas, there's a secret to how I attained these books. For you see, when they have a treasure such as these, people are extremely reluctant to let them go. So reluctant, unfortunately, that many of them would carry them to their grave. And many literally do. So how did you make them part with them? Do you pay them?" "No, son. I believe it a great disservice to bury a book under mounds of earth. So I see it as my duty to free them." "You take it from them before death, then?" "No, son," he said, leading me to a closet in the library, where there were boots and a shovel caked in mud. "I pry them from their cold, dead fingers. Some may call me a grave robber, but I consider it a grave liberator." And 1 year after my father's death, I donned the boots and took up the shovel, knowing that a Madame Fitzgerald 2 countries over had just died and was an avid collector. That night, under a half moon, I freed 2 books from her coffin, books that deserved a better fate than to be fodder for worms. I took the first book my father had given me, the records of Kingsbury Inn, and opened it on the desk of the library, leaving it as a testament to his memory. And in that time, Miss Latham too returned to the estate, keeping me company as she swept and performed laundry. Over the years, I spent more and more time in the library as its contents grew, opening and reading books by the light of the fire. Soon, I became well known as my collection grew, tripling in size, and visitors would come to see me and discuss the books in my library. "Sir," said Miss Latham on the day of my first visitor, as a book concerning medieval theology lay open on my lap. "Sir, there is a visitor for you." "Go ahead, bring them in," I answered. And so, Miss Latham brought in a visitor, a young woman dressed in a black habit who identified herself as Sister Susan. And before I could object, Miss Latham pulled a pen from her pocket and scrawled the nun's name into the open antique book my father had given me on the desk. "No, wait, Miss Latham, why would you do that? That book was a collectible." "Oh, dearie, it only seemed natural," she said with a smile, and returned to her cleaning. The nun stayed for some time, and soon it became apparent that she too had read the book on my lap, and we had the most interesting discussions about it. Though despite her pleasantness, I found myself at the edge of my seat, unsettled by something about her. Particularly, the way she kept glancing at my hands as they held the edges of the book. But before I had the chance to comment on her behavior, she stood, speaking. "Thank you for your conversation. It's been quite some time since I've enjoyed one. I fear I must be going now, though." She departed before I could say another word, and I closed the book on my lap as she left, returning it to the shelf. Every few weeks I would have another visitor, and every time they would identify the book I was reading, mentioning key details about its contents. And I feared that they had come to steal them from my collection. There was a math teacher, who spoke endlessly of the theorem book I held, or the mother of 4 that had personally read Little Women to their daughters every night before bed. Each of the names were recorded by Miss Latham, despite my best intentions. "Miss Latham!" I nearly screamed as a new visitor entered the room, a man in his 40s. "I swear, if you add another name to that book, you will be out of a job. Wherever did you work before this that it was acceptable?" "Oh, it was my duty at my last place of work." "Which was?" "The Kingsbury Inn, dearie, 1821 to 1827, in this very book, before your father dug it up and pulled it from my grasp." I froze there, my back stiffened, and then closed the book on my lap as I stood. With a sigh, the man in front of me faded from existence as the pages folded, his material flesh mixing with air. I jumped across the room, and Miss Latham laughed, skidding around the spot where the man, the ghost, had just been. And then I slammed the first book of my collection shut, as Miss Latham smiled one last time, and then winked away from existence. For more creepy tales by this author, check out his book, Eden's Eye. Also, I'm conducting a little experiment. I want to see how many Twitter followers I can get. So, follow me on Twitter at KingSpook